This is Philosophy Bites with me, Nigel Warburton.
And me, David Edmonds.
If you enjoy Philosophy Bites, please support us. For details, go to www.philosophybites.com.
Karl Popper famously condemned Plato for being a precursor to totalitarianism, and it's become received wisdom about Plato that he had anti-democratic instincts. Melissa Lane argues that this is a crude reading of Plato's writings. In particular, Plato advocated strong restrictions on the rulers.
Melissa Lane, welcome to Philosophy Bites.
Thanks, Nigel. Great to talk to you.
The topic we're going to focus on today is Plato, rule and office. Before we get on to rule and office, could you just very briefly say something about Plato and particularly the Republic, the work that epitomizes his political philosophy?
Plato's Republic is famous for being believed to advocate the rule of philosopher kings and queens, and it's believed that that's meant to be an untrammeled absolutist rule. And one story of Plato's political development in his lifetime is that by the end of his life, he realized the dangers of that kind of rule and moved to advocating a more constitutionalist, at least second best form of governance. So what I want to argue about Plato's Republic is that, in fact, built into the Republic is a structured political constitutional order where, in fact, far from advocating untrammeled absolutist power, the whole concern of the Republic is how do you control rulers and office holders to make sure that they're serving the public good and that they're not in danger of becoming corrupt and using their power to exploit others for their own ends.
So famously, Plato put philosophers in charge of the ideal republic, and they were the guardians. These were the people who were kept away from anything that might lead them astray and led a very pure kind of existence. But they had incredible power.
That's right. So the word guardian is an important word here. So in the Greek, it's a noun, phulax, which can mean guard. It can mean a military guard. And when it's introduced in the dialogue, it's actually introduced in that context. But it also can come to have this constitutionalist connotation of somebody who's responsible for overseeing a constitutional order. So there were people called nomophulakes in some existing Greek constitutions, which meant that they were the guardians of the laws. And so I think that the Republic is really working within a broader established institutional paradigm where in the Greek cities, and not only democracies, but also oligarchies that surrounded Plato at the time, there were positions of political office that were limited sets of powers that each office holder held. And I think that what Plato's doing in the Republic, and we can see this in the language that he uses, he's actually reflecting on how well do the existing limits on power work in keeping those rulers oriented to the good of the ruled, and are there actually ways of doing it better?
Why is this particularly constitutionalist?
So by constitutional, in fact, we mean, to begin with, the Greek title of the dialogue. So we refer to it as Republic, which comes from the Latin title, which Cicero used to refer to it, de re publica, which in Latin is about public affairs or public things. In Greek, the title of the dialogue is politeia, which in fact can be translated as constitution. And a politeia meant a combination of offices and laws. And it also more broadly could mean a way of life of a whole society that the offices and laws sort of broadly serve to foster. So the clue of the title, I think, directs us to actually ask the question, well, how are these positions of power in the dialogue structured? How are they limited and controlled? What expectations and demands are held of people? And as you said, it is important that the rulers have to be educated to be self-disciplined and self-controlled, but there are institutions that are part of the structure that are meant to achieve that. So when I say constitutionalist, I mean in a sense which is politically relevant and resonant today, where a constitution is a set of political positions which are limited and controlled. And I think that's exactly what it meant in Plato's day, and it is what we see, in fact, in the dialogue.
So what about the office of the guardians? What does that involve?
Yeah, so I see the guardians actually at the top of a ladder of moving up through political positions in which they have to be tested and perform appropriately before they get promoted to the highest level. And what's really fascinating is that at an earlier stage, they're described as literally holding offices, plural offices that involve military offices, which were standard offices in Greek cities, and also other offices, it said, which are appropriate to young people. And I love that line because these are people who are supposed to be 35 to 50. But Plato says these are young people. And those people, I think, are being tested and held accountable for their performance in those offices. And those who succeed go on to further study and further ethical testing as well as intellectual testing. And at the highest ranks, we can think of them as the super guardians, the senior guardians. And as I understand it, the role of those guardians is to be rulers, but not office holders, in the sense that there's no external people above them to hold them accountable, but they crucially are still subject to restrictions on holding property. They're subject to restrictions on their family life. There is a group of them, so they can sort of check each other. They rotate in the time that they spend in that role of ruling. And I see their role as then making sure that the office holders under them and all the people who are being trained to potentially hold office actually remain appropriately oriented to caring for the good of the ruled.
Why did Plato put so many restrictions on the guardians? It seems pretty cruel to stop them owning property, to have this kind of very strict upbringing away from other people. Why couldn't he just choose some good people and let them rule the state?
That's a great question. And this is really, I think, the heart of what the dialogue is concerned about. In fact, that very objection is made by one of the characters in the dialogue at the beginning of book 4. They say, you're putting so many restrictions on these people. It's like they're just going to live as soldiers in an armed camp. They're not going to be able to enjoy the privileges and benefits of rule. And, normally people who are in power get special dispensations. They have nice food. They have wine. They have all kinds of things. And that, I think, is exactly the heart of the project, is to say these people are meant to be public servants. And that, I think, we should take seriously. That's a paradox. When we think about rulers, we don't think about rulers being servants. Rulers are the people in charge who tell other people what to do. So Plato literally uses this language that the role of the ruler is to serve others and to care for them. And we're meant to see that as paradoxical and challenging. And if that's their role, then they're not in it for themselves. We can't allow them to be in it for themselves. And crucially, we can't trust that people will simply be good people. We have to put these restrictions even on these people who've been through this very demanding education, who are being tested all the time. Still, we have to prevent them from having the possibility of becoming corrupt through trying to amass property or to try to benefit their own kin.
Can you stop a politician becoming corrupt?
Well, I think this is what the Republic is trying to do. Now, I think that for me, a really crucial line comes at the end of book 3. So when these restrictions on property and family for the guardians are first introduced, Socrates, who's the person leading the dialogue, says all of this should be established as law. He uses a very clear verb for establishing laws. Now, people will say to me, well, who's in charge of the laws? Who's in charge of enforcing the laws? Ultimately, the guardians themselves, those senior guardians. So, really, that's not any kind of real restriction. But what I would say is in every political system, ultimately, there has to be somebody who's in charge of enforcing the laws. And we do have a paradox then about who controls those people. So in the United States, there is a paradox about how can the Supreme Court be held to ethical standards. They've just, for the first time, voluntarily adopted a code of ethical practice in recent years, but no one has the power to enforce that on them. So I don't think that any constitutional order can sort of perfectly solve that problem. So I actually don't think that that's a special vulnerability of Plato's system. I think that it's more generally a vulnerability of any constitutional system. And he's doing his best to kind of plug that hole, and other systems try to plug it also. But no system is perfect, and I think he does know that. In fact, the Republic describes that ultimately even this ideal political constitutional order will start to decline. So he doesn't think that you can stave off corruption forever.
Psychologically, that's really interesting because you read the Republic and other works by Plato, and there's something peculiarly modern about the worry that people with power are going to abuse that power. Do you think that's some kind of human universal?
Yeah, so I don't think it is modern. I think it is ancient as well. I think it's pretty close to being a human universal, that if there's power, there's the danger that power can be abused. And so political orders are trying to come up with ways to do that. And I should say that, I think Plato, because he recognizes that any system is going to have its Achilles heel in this respect, where it will have a vulnerability. So in other writings, he experiments with other kinds of political system that might do it differently. And I think that itself is telling that, yes, he thinks this is one way that in some situations could potentially work, but it is very demanding, might not always be possible. So we have to also look at other ways in which it might also potentially at least be partially achieved.
One of the ways that modern societies and some ancient societies avoided having a perpetual corrupt leader is having some kind of election or rotation at least. But elections, democracy, those were things that Plato actually opposed. Why did he reject democracy?
So as I see it, there are broader aspects to that question, but I want to focus on these institutional dimensions. So I would say that when Plato looks at Athenian democracy and other democracies in the Greek world, I don't think we have to see his critique as only targeted at democracy, because democracy in his time also had these accountability mechanisms. So office holders were put into office, they could be held to account. There were elections, in fact, in ancient Athens, as well as some offices that were filled by lottery. But sometimes we think all of ancient Athens was based on lottery, and that isn't true. In fact, all the military offices and some of the high financial offices were filled by election. So those institutions are not alien to him. He's aware of their existence. Now, in the Republic, I think that he does pick up on the idea of accountability, because what's the idea of accountability? It's holding office holders to account. And he picks up on the idea of rotation and term limits. So when we look at those highest guardians, they have, in a way, an age limit when they can enter into the office. They're meant to take turns actually exercising those powers. So there's a kind of rotation. But the accountability idea is the most perhaps unexpected, because in Greek, the language for accountability that he saw in Athens and elsewhere was didonai logon, which means literally give an account. And that's exactly the language that was used for these financial and other audits that Greek cities all practiced. Plato uses that phrase for the philosophers doing philosophy with each other, what he calls philosophical dialectic with each other, making arguments with each other. And I think what he's saying is the heart of accountability. If you say to someone, give me an account of your power, they have to make an argument. They have to explain how they use their power and defend it. And that's what the philosophers are trained in doing. So I don't think he's just changing the subject or rejecting the idea of accountability. I think he's actually saying, well, wait a minute. At bottom, what is accountability? Accountability is being able to explain. It's being able to reason and give arguments. And that's what philosophers in the Republic are going to be trained to do. So we will have a kind of accountability, even for the highest guardians, even though it doesn't look exactly the way it looked in these other institutional settings.
Many people think of the study of classical philosophy as a kind of isolated thing that is really fascinating. It's a museum of ideas. It's a rich tradition. It explains kind of genealogy of how we got some of our ideas as well. But ultimately, it's not feeding into present-day debates about political philosophy.
No, so when I started to think about this question, I did start from the words of the text. As I said, I started from this fact that the same lines of Plato could be translated as ruling and as office holding. And I started to think about, why do people translate it one way or the other? What's at stake? But the more I thought about that, the more I came to see that the question of how do you limit political power? How do you constrain it? And what is it used for? Is it used to benefit people or to exploit them? That set of questions, I think, is a real question. I think those are Plato's questions, and I think they are, unfortunately or fortunately, questions that all of us face today.
Melissa Lane, thank you very much.
Thank you, Nigel.
For For more Philosophy Bites, go to www.philosophybites.com. You can also find details there of Philosophy Bites books and how to support us.